Just gonna leave me here alone. Oh, we got some people joining. Bella, look. Got people looking at us. Say hi.
What I'd like to say to the courts that Shannon, Bella, and Nico are loving, caring people. They love life. They love being around people who love them. They always had good times. This is the first time they went to the beach this year, and they loved it. But God only knows what happened that night. Life will never be the same without Shannon, Bella, and Celeste and Nico. Had all their lives to live. They were taken by a heartless one. This is the heartless one that
If this stillness holds you, a quiet gesture helps sustain these long-form investigations. Taking a moment to like the video or subscribe allows stories like this to be examined with the time and care they demand, bringing hidden truths into focus, one layer at a time.
evil monster who dare you take the lives of my daughters Shannon, Bella, Celeste, and Nico. I trusted you to take care of them, not kill them. And they also trusted you. The heartless monster, and then you take them out like trash. You disgust me. They were loving and caring people. You may have taken their bodies from me, but you will never take the love they had from me. They loved us more than you will ever know, because you don't know what love is. Because if you did, you would not have killed them. You monster, thought you would get away with this. I don't know how. The cameras do not lie. You carry them out like trash of the house. Yes, I seen the videotape. You buried my daughter Shannon and Nico in a shallow grave, and then you put Bella and Celeste in huge containers of crude oil. You heartless monster. You have to live with this vision every day of your life, and I hope you see that every time you close your eyes at night. Oh, I forgot. You have no heart or feelings or love. Let me tell you something. I will think of them every day of my life, and I love them every day of my life. Prison is too good for you. This is hard to say, but may God have mercy on your soul. I hope you enjoy your new life. It's nothing like the one you had out here. May the courts have no mercy on you. It's hard every day. It hurts in so many ways. I have heard people say that you're not a monster. No, you are not. You're an evil monster. Thank you. Love you, Shannon, Bella, and Nico. Love you, Pop and Dad. And one other thing. And Shannon says she is super excited for justice today. Thank you, Your Honor.
Thank you, sir. The past 3 months, I barely slept because I've been going through a lot of different emotions because I did not see this coming. You went from being my brother, my sister's protector, one of the most loved people in my family, to someone I will spend the rest of my life trying to understand. What gave you the right to put your hands on a woman, let alone my best friend, my beloved sister, your daughters, and your son? Why weren't they enough for you? In the blink of an eye, you took away my whole world, the people that mattered to me the most. Everything in my life I loved, your children. They trusted you. They loved you. They looked up to you because you promised to keep them safe. Instead, you turned on your family. My blood is boiling as I write these last words because they are the last you will ever hear from me. I can't even think of the right words to describe the betrayal and the hate I feel. And to be honest, you aren't even worth the time and effort it takes to put my pen to this paper. There isn't a day that goes by that I don't cry for my family. They were my whole world. All I do is ask myself why. Why would you do this? You don't deserve to be called a man. What kind of person slaughters the people that love them the most? Did you really think you would get away with this? Did you really think that this was your best option, to throw away your family like they were garbage? They deserve better, and you know it. I hope you spend the rest of your life staring at the ceiling every night, being haunted by what you've done. None of us deserved this. Hearing my mother and father cry themselves to sleep in this hotel room causes me anguish that is beyond words. I can't describe how this feels, how badly my heart is breaking for my poor parents. We trusted you. You have taken away my family from this earth, but you can never take them from my heart. You took away my privilege of being an uncle to the most precious little girls I've ever known. I will never hear the words Uncle Frankie again, but you will never be called Dad again either. You'll never be able to put your hands on another woman, let alone my best friend, my beloved sister, and your son. I just can't comprehend how they weren't enough for you. Shanann, Bella, and Cece loved you more than anyone. You were their hero. How could you destroy the people who loved them the most? I pray that you never have a moment's peace or a good night's rest in the cage you'll spend every day of your life in. A cage you are privileged to live in because my family isn't evil like you. We begged the district attorney to spare your life because despite everything, we believe that no one has the right to take the life of another, even someone like you. I feel sorry for your family. I know the pain that they must feel knowing that they can't hug you, because that's how my mother, father, and I feel every time we cry for our family. Nothing hurts more than watching or hearing my family weep for their loved ones. I just wish that I could tell that you would tell the truth, but I know that that is asking for more than you are capable of. I stayed up all night writing this statement. I don't sleep because of you. My life will never be the same because of you, but at least my conscience is clear. I get to live free, but I can't say the same for you. I haven't slept in 2 days because I've been anxiously waiting for this moment, the moment I get to tell you how I feel, how this has affected my family and I. My family and I can finally grieve after today. If anything, we will come out of this stronger today than we were before, and we will continue to pray for your family. Sincerely, Frankie Rusick.
Thank you, James.
In the minutes before dawn, the world can feel rehearsed. Streetlights hold their pale circles on the pavement as if the darkness is something that can be pinned down and contained. A suburban block sits in the stillness of early morning, trimmed hedges and clean driveways arranged like a promise. The kind of place built to convince itself that nothing truly bad can happen here, not in these quiet lines of houses, not beneath this wide Colorado sky. And yet, in the faint glow that leaks from porch lamps and garage indicators, there is a different kind of quiet beginning to form. Not the quiet of rest, but the quiet of omission. The silence of a space that should contain movement, voices, routine, and does not. The air holds the impression of a night that ended without its natural conclusion, as if something has been erased so thoroughly that the house itself is waiting for an explanation it will never receive. A garage door becomes more than a garage door when it lifts into the dark at the wrong hour. A vehicle becomes more than a vehicle when it moves with a purpose that does not match the day it is entering. A front entry becomes more than an entry when the world begins to sense that whoever crossed that threshold last did not bring normal life back with them. At first, nothing looks broken. There is no visible violence from the outside, no scattered glass, no obvious rupture. The home remains intact in the shallow light, a structure.
I wanted to say thank you for this moment. I want to take a moment to thank everyone who has prayed for our beloved family, who had sent gifts, cards to us from all over the world. I know God will put the evil people where they need to be. I also want to take the time to thank the town of Frederick, Greeley, FBI, the DA's office, the CBI, for exceptional work. We thank Nicole Atkinson, Shannon's neighbor Nathan, and his family. To me, they're our heroes. They really are. God bless. God makes no mistakes on who he puts in your life. Marriage is about love, trust, and friendship and unity. We marry for sickness and health, to death do us part. Our daughter Shannon loved you with all of her heart. Your children loved you to the moon and back. Shannon's family was her world. Shannon put a crown on your head. But unfortunately, the day that you took their life, God removed that crown. We loved you like a son. We trusted you. Your faithful wife trusted you. Your children adored you, and they also trusted you. Your daughter Bella Marie sang a song proudly. And I don't know if you got to see it, but it was Daddy, You're My Hero. I have no idea who gave you the right to take their lives. But I know God and his mighty angels were there at that moment to bring them home to paradise. God gives us free will. So not only did you take the family of four, your family of four, you took your own life. I want the world to know that our daughter and her children were so loved by us. There will always be protected by God and his mighty angels. I didn't want death for you because that's not my right. Your life is between you and God now, and I pray that he has mercy for you. From Shannon's mother, Bella Marie, Celeste Catherine, and Nico Lee's, Nana. Thank you, Your Honor.
I'm Cindy Watts.
Ron Watson.
Thank you. And I have authorized you to make a statement to the court as paternal grandparents of the children. And if you choose not to make a statement, but your designee, Ms. Powers, chooses to, she can do so as well. How would you like to proceed
Can I
today?
read that? I want you to start, but I would like to read
Who's
that.
going to be speaking today?
Your Honor, initially, they've asked me, and they're hoping that they have the strength to speak, but if they do not, they've written out their statements and asked me to finish for them. So
That would be fine. Who would like to go first?
if I could start, Your Honor. On behalf of the Watts, Your Honor, and to the community, we thank you for the opportunity and the recognition under the Victim Bill of Rights. We come today as the grandparents and the parent of the daughter and children whose life was taken in this case. We are not here to ask for leniency. We are not in any way condoning or tolerating the crime that has occurred and the pain that has been caused. We join in our daughter-in-law and grandchildren's family in saying this should never have happened. This is not condonable. This is something that we will never get over. We appreciate the consideration that everyone has paid, most especially the families that have lost everyone. We appreciate that they begged for Christopher's life. We agree and echo what they have said, that it is not his place to take anyone's life, nor would it be our place as a community to take his life. So we thank you for the opportunity and for every consideration and effort that's been put out. The prosecution in this case has in fact respected the Victim Bill of Rights. They took the time to explain that the information that my clients had at the time that they were interviewed was not correct. They were misinformed. They were searching for answers. They were not intending to cause any pain to anyone, and they appreciate that the prosecution answered their questions and gave them the time and the respect and the consideration so that they could tell this court and everyone in this community that the interview content was not their message, that they accept that their son has done this, that they accept that he chose to plead guilty, that he sought and requested their consent and agreement for a life sentence. They appreciate that he is given the opportunity to serve that life sentence. It is his responsibility, it is his sentence, and it is not enough to make up for what has done. We understand and we join the family in that we have questions. We don't know how such a thing could possibly happen, or that a man that was responsible for raising his children and protecting his wife would take the steps that he did, and that he would disregard their bodies and the love that he had for them and they had for him and everyone else, and take the gestures and put this community through the investigation and the discovery and the responsibility of bringing justice. We do not understand that. We do not think it was appropriate. We cannot begin to think that an explanation will ever justify it. My clients indicate that they understand that a full opportunity for a confession with all of the responsibility and accountability has not occurred. And they support the family and the request that that happen, if not today, at an appropriate time, in an appropriate manner, so that everyone can have peace, to understand to the best of their ability the details that they need and to have their questions answered. And by giving this opportunity of a life sentence, we hope that he embraces that moment. That had the death penalty been pursued, there would not have been an opportunity to be accountable and to give a full confession. And had the death penalty been sought, counsel would have fought for his life, the prosecutors would have been engaged in a multiple-year battle, the families would have been torn apart, this community would have had to subsidize it and endure it, and we have so much respect and gratefulness that that did not happen. We would strongly encourage Christopher Watts to give that full confession in the tone and in the timing that he thinks is appropriate with the guidance of his counsel. We feel that it would be appropriate and helpful to ease the pain and the suffering. But we also say we don't think that there's anything that he can say that will ever account for his behavior. There's nothing that can be done to cure the harm he has caused. And he has the responsibility to serve his sentence with dignity and with regard for everyone, and to spend every breath that he has left in an atonement for what he has done. Do you want to read it?
Yes.
If I could just have you state your name for the record.
Cindy Watts.
Thank you.
My name is Cindy Watts. I am the grandmother of two beautiful granddaughters, Bella Marie, Celeste Catherine Watts. I am also the mother of Christopher Watts, who I will be directing most of my statement to. First, I'd like to begin by recognizing the absolute horror of this crime and acknowledging the devastating loss that both the Rusek family as well as our family have faced. Our families have been irreparably broken by the needless deaths of Shanann, Bella, Cece, and Nico. This is something we will never get over. We will always mourn the loss of our family, and in that we are united in our grief. I am still struggling to understand how and why this tragedy occurred. I may never be able to understand and accept it, but I pray for peace and healing for all of us. Now to my son Christopher. I have known you since the day you were born into this world. I have watched you grow from a quiet and sweet, curious child who Bella reminded me so much of, to a young man who worked hard in sports and later mechanics to achieve your goals. You are a good friend, brother, father, and son. We have loved you from the beginning, and we still love you now. This might be hard for some to understand, how I can sit here under these circumstances and tell you, although we are heartbroken, although we can't imagine what could have led us to this day, but we love you. Maybe you can't believe it either. As the Lord said in Jeremiah 3:31, I have loved you with an everlasting love. Therefore, I have continued my faithfulness to you. And you, as your mother, Chris, I have always loved you, and I still do. I hate what has happened. Your father and sister and I are struggling to understand why. But we will remain faithful as your family, just as God remains faithful because of his unconditional love for us all. We love you.
We forgive you, son.
Thank you.
Judge, if I could read Mr. Watts' statement.
Yes.
My name is Ronnie Watts, and I am the grandfather of Bella, Celeste, Nico Watts, and I am the father of Shannon. I am the father of Christopher Watts as well. And one of the most important things I've done in my life is to raise my children and to watch as they started their own families. I spent many years coaching Little League and talking to my son, taking him to the races, and sharing my love and knowledge of cars with him. He was just as involved with his girls. I believe he loves his girls. I know he does. This tragedy has impacted my family in so many ways. Beyond losing my precious grandchildren, our beloved daughter-in-law, we are forced to question everything. We still don't have all the answers, and I hope one day, Christopher, you can help us. Chris, I want to talk to you as a father and son. You are here today accepting responsibility, but I want to tell you this now. I love you. Nothing will ever change that. And I want you to find peace. And today is your first step. The Bible says if we confess our sins, God is faithful and just and will forgive us. Chris, I forgive you, and your sister forgives you, and we will never abandon you, and we love you. Dad. Judge, thank you for the opportunity to address the court.
Objectively say that this is perhaps the most inhumane and vicious crime that I have handled out of the thousands of cases that I have seen. And nothing less than a maximum sentence would be appropriate. And anything less than the maximum sentence would depreciate the seriousness of this offense. Deputies, I would respectfully ask that you take this defendant into custody and have him serve the rest of his life in the Department of Corrections. We are in recess.
Still holding its shape, still presenting the face of a family life. That is part of what makes the story so unsettling in its first breath. The scene does not announce tragedy. It disguises it behind the familiar. When the lens widens, the family inside that house is not introduced through spectacle. They are introduced through what the modern world preserves best, carefully framed images of domestic life, the bright theater of ordinary days. A couple building a public narrative of stability. Two young children, small enough that their bodies seem made of constant motion and soft trust. A mother whose presence is vivid, who appears to live at the center of the household's emotional weather, organizing, planning, documenting, shaping the chaos of family life into something that resembles order. A father who appears quieter, often on the edges of the energy, his composure reading as patience, his stillness reading as reliability. In the beginning, the stillness seems harmless. Chris Watts is not introduced as a man who storms through rooms. He does not look from the outside like a person who carries danger openly. His danger, if it exists, is the kind that hides behind control rather than noise. A man who can keep his face smooth while the people around him strain. A man who can withdraw without the courtesy of explanation. A man who can make his household feel in subtle ways as if emotional warmth is conditional, granted only when the atmosphere pleases him. Control of this kind does not always leave marks that can be photographed. It leaves patterns. It leaves the feeling that a room changes when he enters, that conversations bend toward what he will tolerate. That affection can be withheld with a precision that feels deliberate, not accidental. That disagreement does not become a loud argument but a colder thing, a quiet refusal, a long silence that forces the other person to fill it, to apologize, to repair, to carry the emotional labor alone. Shannon Watts, in contrast, appears to move through life with outward warmth and urgency, a person who invests in connection, who tries to name the shape of a day, who tries to make family life visible and celebratory. She is the kind of person whose energy can be mistaken for control when viewed superficially, because she posts and plans and speaks in the language of goals. But the closer observation reveals something else, an emotional presence that seeks response and often meets a wall. A desire to keep the family together, to keep the story coherent, to keep the household functioning, even when the ground underneath it begins to shift. The children exist in that space the way children do, absorbing atmosphere without understanding its source. They cling, they laugh, they test boundaries. They seek comfort and receive it, and sometimes in small, quiet moments, they also sense when comfort is withheld, when the room becomes tense, when a parent's mood becomes something that must be navigated rather than simply lived beside. A family can endure many ordinary strains: bills, exhaustion, the repeated demands of parenting, the relentless negotiation required by two adults sharing a life. In most homes, those strains produce friction but not disaster. They produce bad days, not endings. But there is a particular vulnerability in a household when one person's emotional withdrawal becomes a tool, when the warmth of the home begins to depend on appeasement. The imbalance does not announce itself all at once. It accumulates. Chris's presence is often described by those who knew the family as calm, quiet, unremarkable. Yet calm can be a mask for something colder. In the recorded fragments of their life, the distance between Chris and the rest of the household sometimes feels like more than temperament. It feels like a choice. The way his face can remain neutral when the people beside him are expressive. The way his engagement can appear minimal, as if participation is something he offers rather than something he shares. The way the household's emotional tone seems to pivot around whether he is receptive or not. That pivot is not a dramatic tyranny, it is a subtle gravity. A controlling person does not always need to raise a hand or raise a voice. Sometimes control is exerted through absence, through the quiet message that affection must be earned and can be revoked. Through the slow conditioning that teaches a partner to anticipate moods, to adjust herself, to soften her needs, to perform reassurance over and over in the hope that the household will return to a stable temperature. In the background, practical pressures deepen the sense of fragility. Money has its own atmosphere. It lives in the air of a home even when it is not spoken aloud, tightening decisions, sharpening anxiety, making every planned celebration carry a shadow of calculation. A family that appears polished online can still be carrying private instability, the kind that forces quiet arguments and uneasy compromises. Financial strain does not create violence by itself, but it can become a tool in the hands of someone who uses leverage naturally, someone who prefers to have the upper hand without ever naming the contest. By 2018, Shannon is pregnant again. The coming child represents continuity, another link in the chain of family life. But pregnancy also magnifies vulnerability. It demands trust. It demands partnership. It demands that the person beside you remains beside you in more than physical proximity. This is where the atmosphere begins to turn. Chris's emotional distance becomes harder to ignore. The subtle patterns of control sharpen into something more explicit in effect, even if not in display. He becomes less responsive, less available, less willing to meet Shannon's emotional reality with anything that resembles care. He reduces the household's warmth without explanation and watches what happens. And what happens is predictable. Shannon tries harder. She reaches more. She attempts to repair what she can feel slipping, because she is living inside a life that depends on mutual participation, and she is sensing that the participation is becoming one-sided. A manipulative person often does not say directly that he is withdrawing. He lets the other person discover it, live inside it, panic inside it. He forces the other person to do the work of naming the shift, and then he can respond with a kind of flat denial, a refusal to acknowledge the obvious. This is how someone can make a partner question her own perception without ever openly attacking it. The result is a slow disorientation, the feeling that something is wrong combined with the lack of any stable admission that it is. In the summer, the family spends time apart. Shannon and the children are away, surrounded by a different environment, other voices, other routines. Physical distance changes what can be hidden. It removes the daily camouflage of shared space. It makes patterns visible in a harsher light because communication becomes a choice rather than an automatic consequence of being in the same rooms. And Chris's choices begin to look like abandonment. The contact becomes sparse, colder, inconsistent. Attention is not simply reduced, it feels strategically rationed. The kind of reduction that is not explained by work alone, not explained by exhaustion alone. The kind of reduction that sends a message without sending words. Shannon responds the way many emotionally present people respond, with urgency, with attempts to reconnect, with heightened sensitivity to small changes. She is trying to stabilize the bond while the bond is being quietly loosened. During this period, another life begins to grow alongside the visible one. An affair is not merely a betrayal of a spouse. In a story like this, it is an alternate future taking shape. It is a private world where Chris is not a husband with responsibilities and financial strain, not a father bound to routines, not a man accountable to a household that demands emotional participation. In the affair, he can be newly admired, newly free, newly unburdened. He can inhabit a self that feels lighter precisely because it has not been tested by real domestic life. This is where self-centeredness becomes more than a personality trait. It becomes a force. When a person begins to value his own comfort above the existence of those who depend on him, he starts to treat their needs as intrusions. He begins to see the people closest to him not as lives to protect, but as barriers to his preferred version of himself. That shift does not require outward cruelty to be devastating. It only requires the internal permission to dehumanize quietly, to convert a spouse into a problem to solve and children into consequences to erase. As Shannon's pregnancy advances, the tension becomes more pronounced. A new child tightens the future. It removes exits. It increases obligation. And for someone who has already begun to imagine himself elsewhere, obligation becomes intolerable. Not because he cannot bear the work of fatherhood, but because fatherhood in that moment threatens the fantasy he has been feeding. It is in this stage that the domestic imbalance becomes unmistakable, not through shouting, but through absence and coldness. Through the way Chris can make Shannon feel alone while still being technically present. Through the way he can deprive the household of reassurance while allowing the outside image of the family to remain intact. Through the way he can behave as if he is being asked too much simply by being asked to show care. The children, in the midst of all of this, remain what children always are: dependent, trusting, emotionally open. They reach for the parent who feels warm. They adapt to the parent who feels distant. They do not have language for manipulation, but they live inside its consequences. They learn, without instruction, which moods are safe and which moods should be avoided. They feel the temperature of a room the way small bodies always do, instinctively. As the summer closes in on its last weeks, Shannon returns to Colorado with the children. The return is supposed to restore routine. It is supposed to bring the household back into the familiar rhythms that make a family feel real. But routine, once fractured by emotional withdrawal, does not automatically heal. It can become a stage where the same imbalance plays out more sharply, because now the distance is no longer abstract. It is visible in the same rooms beneath the same roof. The house begins to feel different, not in furniture, not in layout, but in atmosphere. A home can carry tension like a scent. It clings to corners. It lives in the quiet between movements. It turns simple interactions into negotiations. Shannon moves through the space trying to re-establish connection. Chris moves through the space as if connection is optional. He offers just enough to maintain plausible normalcy and withholds enough to keep control. Control does not always look like dominance. Sometimes it looks like refusal, the refusal to engage, the refusal to comfort, the refusal to admit what is changing. When one partner is emotionally present and the other is strategically absent, the present partner begins to exhaust herself trying to reach what cannot be reached. And exhaustion changes people. It makes them more desperate, more reactive, more fragile. It makes them easier to manipulate because they are already unsure of their footing. A controlling person can exploit that fragility without appearing overtly aggressive. He only needs to remain calm while the other person becomes visibly anxious. The contrast alone can make her look unstable and him look reasonable, even when the instability is a direct product of his withdrawal. By the time the final weekend arrives, the household is carrying multiple layers of pressure, emotional fracture, practical stress, a pregnancy demanding care, and a private secret life pulling Chris away from the family's shared reality. The house still looks like a family home. The children still live inside it as if it is secure. Shannon still lives inside it as if it can be repaired. But the center of the household, the shared agreement that everyone belongs to the same future has begun to hollow out. In the late hours of that Sunday night, the world outside the home is quiet. Streets are empty, lights are low. The neighborhood offers its usual illusion of safety. Inside, the domestic space holds the objects of ordinary life: beds, toys, laundry, the unfinished traces of routine. And Chris, moving within that space, is no longer simply a husband withdrawing. He is a man who has already begun to act as if the family's future is negotiable, as if the people in the house can be treated as obstacles rather than lives. The emotional coldness that once functioned as control now begins to feel like preparation. The night thickens. The house holds its breath in the way buildings seem to do when the people inside them are carrying something unspoken. The children sleep, or hover at the edge of sleep, believing in the basic permanence that children are designed to believe in. Shannon returns to the home carrying the weight of her pregnancy and the weight of her fear, still trying to hold the marriage together by force of will. And within that ordinary suburban stillness, with no outward warning and no visible rupture, the story reaches the point where private intention begins to turn into irreversible consequence. And the dawn waiting on the other side of the night is already preparing to reveal that the house has become something else entirely. The hours after that night do not announce themselves with noise. They arrive the way morning always arrives, by habit, by the slow thinning of darkness at the edges of windows, by the ordinary shift of light across a quiet street. From the outside, the house remains a house. Its lines hold. Its driveway remains empty of commotion. Its windows do not broadcast what has happened inside. In suburban neighborhoods, catastrophe often begins with an insultingly normal sunrise. Inside, the air carries a different weight. The domestic space has not changed in furniture or layout, but the meaning of every object has begun to shift. A staircase is no longer a staircase. A hallway is no longer a hallway. A child's room is no longer simply a room. The home becomes a contained environment where the ordinary has been interrupted and rearranged, where the usual sequence of morning life has been broken and replaced by something colder. Chris moves through that space with the kind of focus that does not belong to grief. It belongs to task. A mind that has crossed a line and is now preoccupied with management does not behave like a mind shocked by loss. It behaves like a mind trying to keep the world from seeing what it already knows. He does not need to shout to exert control. He needs only to keep moving, to keep time under his command, to keep the outward appearance of a workday intact long enough for the inside reality to be carried elsewhere. The early morning becomes an exercise in minimizing evidence of disruption. Not because everything can be hidden, but because the first hours are always the most dangerous for someone trying to maintain a false narrative. The home contains too many traces of ordinary life to be erased completely. The best a manipulative mind can do is preserve the surface while removing the people who would contradict it. The garage becomes a threshold between realities. A vehicle idling in the dim light carries the illusion of routine, a man leaving for work, nothing more. But routine can be used as camouflage when a person understands how to wear it. Chris's movements are controlled, contained, purposeful. he does not carry the frantic energy of someone searching. He carries the narrowed energy of someone trying to finish a sequence. Outside, the neighborhood is still asleep. That matters. Sleep is the friend of secrecy. Sleep allows a person to move without being observed, to claim later that nothing unusual happened, to let the world wake up into a story already in progress. As he leaves, the house does not erupt into alarm the way people imagine houses should when tragedy occurs. Houses do not scream, they wait, they hold. They remain standing while the world continues, and the continuation becomes part of the horror. A few hours later, the day begins to press against the absence that has been created. It starts the way missing person stories often start in real life, with expectation, a scheduled appointment, a routine check-in, a mother who does not respond in the way she normally would. In a functioning household, communication leaves patterns, texts answered quickly, calls returned, plans confirmed. When those patterns break, the first sensation is not certainty. It is unease. A small alarm that tries to be polite, tries to remain reasonable, tries to assume the simplest explanation. But this absence does not behave like a simple explanation. The house holds signs of life that should have moved forward into the day and did not. A phone that remains behind, silent where it should be active. Personal items still present that would not be left if the person who owns them left intentionally. The subtle evidence of routine interrupted, of a life that did not pack itself up and walk away. Those details begin to gather attention because they do not belong to a voluntary departure. A pregnant woman does not simply vanish without her essentials. Small children do not disappear without the objects that travel with children. And once those realities are confronted, the narrative of a sudden, impulsive exit begins to crumble. The first entry into the house after the absence is noticed feels like stepping into a space where the air itself is wrong. Everything is familiar, and yet nothing is right. The ordinary domestic mess becomes eerie because it implies continuity that is no longer possible. A blanket left where it fell, shoes by a door, the quiet permanence of objects that did not know the people who used them would not return. Chris returns to the house under the gaze of growing concern, placing himself in the center of the situation the way he always has, physically present, emotionally difficult to access. His demeanor remains controlled, his effect oddly measured against the stakes. He appears to understand at a practical level what a concerned husband should do: acknowledge worry, participate in the search, allow others into the home. Yet the performance has edges. The urgency does not flare naturally. It stays managed, as if he is monitoring his own behavior and adjusting it. That self-monitoring is a hallmark of manipulation. A person who is truly frightened often loses the ability to shape himself. His emotions take over. His words become messy. His movements become uncoordinated. Chris, instead, continues to look like a man trying to keep his body within acceptable limits, trying not to spill. As concern intensifies, it begins to draw in the modern machinery that turns private life into measurable reality. In the world of surveillance cameras, digital footprints, and location data, the morning cannot remain only a story told by the person who was last present. There are other witnesses now. not people but devices. A neighbor's camera that watches a driveway without judgment. A record of movements that does not care about explanation. A timeline built by technology rather than memory. The footage becomes one of those quiet turning points that do not need dramatics. It shows an early morning that does not look like an ordinary departure. It shows activity at the vehicle that feels too deliberate, too involved, too loaded with purpose. It cannot reveal the full reality, but it reveals something equally damaging to a false narrative. It reveals that time and motion existed where the story wants simplicity. The attention shifts. It tightens. Once a story is weakened by external evidence, the person telling it must work harder to keep it alive. Chris is forced to occupy a narrower and narrower space. He cannot rely on vagueness because vagueness becomes suspicious. He cannot rely on emotional performance because his emotional performance does not match what the situation demands. He must answer practical questions that have practical consequences, and every answer creates another point that can be checked against reality. The household's imbalance begins to matter in a new way now, not only as a private dynamic, but as a framework for interpreting behavior. A controlling person often assumes he can manage outcomes through composure. He assumes that if he appears calm and cooperative, the world will accept his framing. He assumes that if he holds the center of the situation, others will orbit him rather than challenge him. But this situation is too stark for orbiting. The absence is too complete. The objects left behind are too telling. The children's disappearance is too incompatible with any ordinary explanation. A mother can leave a marriage. A mother does not leave her children behind without leaving the world a reason it can recognize. As the hours pass, the case begins to move from concern into scrutiny, not because anyone needs to announce the shift, but because the facts demand it. The questions become sharper, the reconstruction more detailed. Where was Chris at each point of the morning? What was his work schedule? What route did he take? What did he do when he arrived? Which locations connect to him and not to the missing family? The focus begins to pull outward from the house and toward the places Chris's routine touches. A workplace, an area of land beyond the suburb's polished streets, industrial sites that do not belong to family life and therefore can conceal its interruption. Places where the human world feels small under the vastness of open sky and equipment built for extraction. The geography changes, and with it the emotional register of the story. The suburb is intimate, familiar, domestic. The oil field landscape is indifferent. It does not care about children. It does not carry the warmth of family rituals. It is utilitarian, harsh, quiet in a different way. A place where a person can imagine that the world will not look too closely. As attention converges on that landscape, Chris's control begins to strain. A manipulative mind can manage a spouse with silence, can manage a household with withdrawal, can manage a narrative for a short time by appearing calm. But it cannot easily manage the combined weight of physical evidence, technology, and the increasingly narrow funnel of time. Every hour that passes without Shannon or the children reappearing turns the story more rigid. The missing do not behave like people who left voluntarily. They behave like people who were taken out of their own lives. Chris is pressed into environments where control is no longer his. Rooms where his posture is observed, where his stillness is not reassuring but strange, where his restraint reads less like stability and more like calculation. The more he is required to account for the absence, the more difficult it becomes to maintain the appearance of a normal husband living inside an abnormal day. The first crack often comes as an attempt to relieve pressure without surrendering fully. A strategic adjustment, a partial admission designed to redirect the narrative away from the self and toward a version of events that seems less monstrous. It is a familiar shape in cases like this, a story that tries to place blame elsewhere, tries to assign the most unbearable act to someone other than the person speaking, tries to make the perpetrator appear reactive rather than initiating. But partial admissions do not survive contact with reality for long. Reality in this case is not an abstract concept, it is physical. It is the hard certainty of where people can be where they cannot be, what objects remain behind, what records show, what time does when it is tracked. The more the story is pressured, the more it collapses under its own contradictions. And then the search moves into its darkest phase, the phase where hope becomes thinner not because anyone announces despair, but because the direction of the search begins to speak for itself. The landscape under the open sky becomes a place of dread. The industrial structures become silhouettes that feel wrong against the idea of children. The quiet becomes heavier because it is no longer the quiet of waiting for someone to come home. It is the quiet of bracing for what will be found. When discovery comes, it does not arrive as dramatic vindication. It arrives as confirmation, and confirmation is always colder than people expect. It turns fear into fact. It turns missing into a reality that cannot be revised. It forces the mind to accept that the domestic world, with its warmth and its routines, has been interrupted in the most final way. In the days that follow, the case shifts again, away from searching and toward processing. Legal rooms and procedures begin to form around the story, not to restore anything, but to contain what remains. The hookup of evidence to accountability is slow and grinding. It does not move with the speed of outrage. It moves with the weight of permanence. Chris, now stripped of the ability to control the narrative through calm, becomes a man enclosed by what he has done. His earlier self-presentation, quiet, dependable, mild, begins to look like a shell that never held the warmth people assumed it did. The emptiness behind it becomes more visible with each step forward, not because anyone needs to label it, but because the consequences have already labeled it in the most irreversible way. And in the background of all this movement, search, scrutiny, narrowing, confirmation, the victims remain central through their absence. Shannon, emotionally present even in the traces she left behind, becomes a figure of vulnerable humanity, a woman trying to hold a family together, carrying a pregnancy, trusting the structure of home. The children remain the most devastating contrast of all, small lives defined by warmth and dependence, removed from the world by an adult decision they could not comprehend. The imbalance that existed in the household now becomes the story's silent spine. The power Chris exerted through coldness, through withdrawal, through the quiet withholding of reassurance, culminates not in an argument that might have ended a marriage, but in an act that ended everything. And as the case continues to harden into official record, the atmosphere does not grow lighter. It grows heavier in a different way, because the world is no longer asking where the family is. The world is beginning to confront the even more unbearable question of how long the family's safety had been compromised before anyone realized the danger was already inside the house. The answer to that question does not live in a single dramatic moment. It lives in accumulation, in the slow normalization of imbalance, in the quiet way a household can be trained to revolve around one person's emotional climate without anyone calling it what it is. In the months before the disappearance, the family's safety was not only physical. It was emotional. It was the feeling that the home was a shared space, that partnership was mutual, that the future belonged equally to everyone inside it. When that feeling begins to erode, the erosion rarely looks like overt threat. It looks like small withdrawals that force the other person to compensate. It looks like affection becoming selective. It looks like warmth becoming conditional. Chris's control did not require spectacle. It required restraint. A person who wants to maintain power without appearing powerful often prefers subtle mechanisms, because subtle mechanisms leave the partner looking reactive while he looks composed. Silence becomes a lever. Detachment becomes a tool. He can deprive the household of reassurance and then watch the household scramble for stability. He can withhold closeness and then stand back as if the resulting distress is evidence of someone else's instability rather than his own deliberate coldness. That is the kind of dynamic that can distort reality inside a home. The emotionally present partner begins to work harder, speak more, explain herself more, apologize more, search for the right arrangement of words and tone that will unlock warmth again. The controlling partner, meanwhile, keeps the key in his pocket and behaves as if the lock is not even there. By the time Shannon returns to Colorado, the relationship has already entered a phase where emotional safety is no longer a shared certainty. Pregnancy amplifies this. It turns the future into a physical fact. It increases dependence. It demands care. It makes the partner's withdrawal feel not merely hurtful but dangerous, because the body is already carrying strain and the mind is already carrying fear. Chris's response to that vulnerability is not to step closer. It is to step away, and to do so with a composure that suggests not confusion but preference. The more Shannon reaches, the more he seems to refuse being reached. The refusal does not need to be announced to be understood. It is felt. It is the kind of refusal that makes a person feel alone while still standing in the same room as someone else. This is the atmosphere the family returns to. A home that still looks like home, but no longer feels like a place where everyone is moving toward the same future. Then the disappearance happens, and the family's safety is reinterpreted through the harshest lens. The public focuses on the day itself, the night itself, the morning itself. But safety is not only what happens in a final hour. Safety is what happens in the long run-up, in the way a person is treated when no one else is watching, in the private patterns that decide whether vulnerability is protected or exploited. When the investigation tightens, it does not move with rage. It moves with procedure. It begins with what can be measured, the timeline, the objects left behind, the digital traces that do not bend to performance. Each measured fact reduces the room available for a false narrative. Each checked detail makes manipulation less effective. Chris is pulled into that narrowing corridor and asked, repeatedly, to live inside the gap between what he presents and what the world can verify. He continues to try to manage the situation the way he has managed his household, by controlling the temperature. He keeps his outward demeanor smooth. He minimizes emotional volatility. He allows others to do the visible work of concern while he remains the quiet center, as if calm will be mistaken for innocence. But as the hours pass, calm begins to look like absence of feeling rather than stability. The lack of natural panic becomes noticeable. The way he moves through the crisis without being overtaken by it begins to feel wrong. The investigation does not need to accuse him loudly. It only needs to keep asking for reality, because reality is what his performance cannot fully reproduce. The evidence begins to form a shape around him. Not a dramatic shape, but a practical one, movements and timing that align with him and not with Shannon. A domestic scene that contradicts the idea of a voluntary departure. An early morning routine that carries too much purposeful activity for a man who claims he simply woke and left for work as usual. The more this shape forms, the more Chris is forced to respond not to emotion but to constraint. Constraint is what breaks controlled people, not anger, not outrage, constraint. A manipulative person thrives in ambiguity because ambiguity gives him space to steer perception. He can redirect, deflect, soften, and stall. But when the world becomes specific, when it demands minutes, locations, explanations that can be checked, his control begins to falter. He is still present, still composed, but the effort required to maintain the mask becomes visible in small ways. The rigid posture, the careful pacing of movement, the sense that he is monitoring himself as if he is an actor who cannot afford a mistake. As the investigation advances, it begins to reveal the private split in his life. A second current running alongside the family's visible world. A connection outside the marriage that offered him a different identity, a different future, a different version of himself unburdened by responsibility. That alternate life becomes relevant not as scandal, but as context. It shows where his attention has been traveling while his family remained trapped inside a home that still depended on him. It shows that his emotional departure had already happened, even while he continued to occupy the physical role of husband and father. This is where the contrast becomes most devastating. Shannon, emotionally present, trying to hold the marriage together, carrying a pregnancy, believing in continuity. Chris, emotionally gone, nursing a private future, reducing the family to something he wants to escape, and treating escape not as a difficult adult transition, but as a problem to solve by removal. The pressure escalates, and Chris is brought into spaces where his usual tools are less effective. Rooms with controlled lighting and controlled time. A setting where movement is observed and recorded, where his body language can no longer float inside the forgiving ambiguity of a living room. The atmosphere becomes clinical and heavy. A person who has relied on emotional control now finds himself surrounded by systems designed to measure inconsistency. In that setting, his narrative begins to show strain. It shifts. It attempts to relocate the worst act away from him. It attempts to cast him as someone caught inside tragedy rather than someone who created it. The shape of this strategy is familiar, an attempt to offer a version of events that reduces culpability while still explaining absence. It is not offered with theatrical flair. It is offered with calculation, as if he is still negotiating how much truth he must surrender in exchange for relief from pressure. But the relief does not come because the facts do not allow it. The investigation continues to narrow. The map of the morning continues to point outward from the house and toward the places connected to him. The landscape beyond the suburb becomes the focus: open fields, industrial infrastructure, vast spaces that feel like they were designed to swallow small human realities. The search there is heavy with a particular kind of dread because it is a place that does not belong to family life. It is a place where the presence of children feels wrong before anything is even found. The sky is large, the ground is functional. The machinery stands with indifferent purpose. It is not a place for laughter, not a place for bedtime stories, not a place where small bodies should ever be. When discovery occurs, the story crosses a threshold it cannot return from. The missing become a confirmed loss. The public's remaining hope collapses into a different kind of silence. The case is no longer about where they are. It is about what was done to them and how a man who lived inside the role of father could have carried out an outcome so final. From this point forward, Chris's control no longer matters in the way he wants it to. The story is no longer his to shape. It is shaped by physical reality, by confirmed absence, by the irreversibility of what has been uncovered. His attempts to manage perception become smaller, less powerful, because the world is no longer guessing. It is processing. The legal system begins its grinding movement. It does not move with human emotion. It moves with schedules, procedures, documents, rooms that look interchangeable from one tragedy to the next. The case becomes organized into counts and filings, not to diminish it, but because the system can only hold horror by translating it into structure. In those rooms, the atmosphere is thick and airless. The stakes are no longer whether the family will return. The stakes are how the world will formally respond to the fact that they will not. Chris appears inside this process as a man who has lost his ability to control the larger narrative, but still carries his old habits in his posture. The restraint remains. The emotional narrowness remains. The sense that he is still trying in small ways to manage how he is perceived remains. Yet the room itself does not cooperate. The weight of the absence is too large. The presence of legal formality does not make the story feel clean. It makes it feel colder because it highlights what cannot be fixed. A sentence can contain him, but it cannot restore them. A decision can finalize the outcome, but it cannot reopen the future that was closed. When judgment arrives, it does not feel like closure. It feels like a door being locked on an empty space. The world is left with a permanent imbalance. A man continues to exist, constrained but alive, while a woman and her children do not. The imbalance is what keeps the story from settling. It leaves a bruise on the concept of home, on the concept of marriage, on the assumptions people carry about quiet men who appear reliable. And Shannon and the children remain what they were in the last preserved fragments: warm, visible, human, caught in a household where emotional safety was already eroding, where the imbalance of power had already begun to reshape daily life, and where the person at the center of that power had already begun to behave as if their future was something he could decide alone. Afterward, the case enters its long afterlife. The house becomes a symbol. The neighborhood becomes a reference point. The family's images become artifacts that people revisit, unable to reconcile the brightness of the before with the darkness of the after. The public keeps returning to the same question because it refuses to be satisfied, not simply what happened, but how the slow domestic imbalance, coldness, control, manipulation could culminate in an act so absolute. The story does not resolve into comfort. It settles into a quiet vigilance, a lingering disturbance that lives behind ordinary domestic scenes, and the sense that the most catastrophic outcomes can be prepared in silence. Long before the world realizes the danger has already moved in and has been living there all along. Living there all along, hidden behind the texture of everyday life, behind routines that people mistake for stability, behind the soft furnishings of a home that was supposed to protect. In the months that follow, the case becomes a kind of slow burning stain on the ordinary. It spreads outward through the collective imagination, not as a sudden panic, but as a persistent discomfort. People begin to notice how much domestic life depends on assumptions that are never spoken aloud. The assumption that the person in the next room is fundamentally safe. The assumption that love, once declared, remains tethered to empathy. The assumption that a father's presence is a kind of guarantee. When those assumptions are violated, the violation does not stay confined to one family. It becomes a quiet question that sits behind other families' lives, even if they do not admit it to themselves. It changes the way people interpret silence. It changes the way they interpret withdrawal. It changes the way they interpret the difference between a man who is simply reserved and a man who uses reserve as a way to keep emotional power in his hands. The Watts case, as it settles into public consciousness, becomes less about a single act and more about the atmosphere that preceded it. Not because people want to blame the victims for not leaving, not because they want to convert tragedy into a checklist, but because the mind is desperate to find the point where danger could have been visible. The mind wants to believe that the controlling coldness had a clear boundary, that it moved from subtle manipulation to catastrophe in a way that could have been recognized in time. But subtle manipulation by design rarely looks like a threat to outsiders. It looks like personality. It looks like temperament. It looks like a couple's private dynamic that other people have no right to interrupt, and inside the relationship it can become normal. A partner learns to lower her expectations. She learns to soften her requests. She learns to interpret emotional starvation as something she can fix if she tries the right approach. She learns to carry the household's emotional continuity alone because carrying it feels better than admitting it no longer exists. That is how control works when it is quiet. It convinces the other person that the imbalance is temporary, manageable, and partly her responsibility. It keeps her moving in circles while the controlling person stands still, conserving energy, conserving power, conserving the right to decide when warmth will be offered and when it will be withheld. After the crime, those patterns are re-examined with a ruthless clarity. The coldness that once looked like passive detachment begins to look like practice. The way Chris could keep his emotions narrow begins to look less like calm and more like a cultivated absence of empathy. The way he could present himself as cooperative while still guarding the truth begins to look like the same method he used at home, controlling what others are allowed to know, controlling the temperature of the room, controlling the narrative by refusing to fully enter it. In the public retelling, there is often a longing to locate a single decisive moment when Shannon could have understood the depth of what was happening beside her. But households do not reveal their worst truths in clean, cinematic flashes. They reveal them gradually in a series of small distortions that become normal if they are not challenged. A partner grows used to being dismissed, grows used to being blamed for overreacting, grows used to being made to feel that her fear is irrational. The controlling person does not have to say the words directly. His behavior teaches them. And so, in retrospect, the household's imbalance feels like a long corridor dimly lit, where the door at the end was closed long before anyone realized the corridor existed. The legal process that follows does not provide emotional relief. It provides structure. Structure is not the same as healing. Courtrooms are not designed to restore dignity to the dead. They are designed to produce a formal response to responsibility. The proceedings move with a kind of heavy inevitability, each step another confirmation that the world cannot return to its earlier shape. In those rooms, Chris appears as a figure who still carries the habits of control. Even stripped of freedom, he remains controlled in presentation, careful in posture, limited in visible emotion. It is not that he cannot feel. It is that what he allows others to see remains guarded, as if he still believes that managing perception is a form of power. He sits inside the weight of what has happened and seems, at least outwardly, to resist being overtaken by it. That resistance becomes one of the enduring discomforts of the case. People expect grief, if not for the victims, then at least as a sign of human collapse. They expect a body to betray the mind, shaking hands, broken breath, visible unraveling. Instead, what they often see is containment, the kind of containment that, in another context, might have been interpreted as composure, but here reads as something colder, a continued refusal to fully inhabit the reality he created. After sentencing, the story does not end. It only changes its container. Prison is a place designed to reduce a person to routine. It takes away choices because choices are the first form of freedom. It replaces the variety of life with repetition, the same walls, the same schedules, the same controlled movements. For many people, that repetition becomes a slow punishment more effective than drama. But for someone accustomed to emotional control, repetition can also become another environment to manage, another space where power can be sought in small ways, through selective communication, through the careful presentation of remorse or detachment, through the subtle shaping of how he is perceived by those who correspond with him. Control does not always die when freedom is removed. Sometimes it simply changes scale. Instead of controlling a household, a person tries to control the story. Instead of controlling a spouse's emotional world, he tries to control the image of himself that survives outside the walls. The impulse remains the same: avoid full vulnerability, avoid full exposure, avoid the raw truth of being seen without the mask. From behind bars, the temptation to reshape the narrative becomes strong, not because it changes the outcome, but because it changes the psychological experience of living inside the outcome. A person who cannot undo what he has done may still try to soften it in language, to rearrange causality, to describe himself as carried along by events rather than steering them. The mind reaches for any framing that allows survival. And yet, every attempt to soften the narrative runs into the same immovable fact: the victims do not get to reframe their story. Their lives ended. Their future ended. Their capacity to be seen as anything other than a tragedy ended at the moment they were removed from the world. Chris's continued existence, even in confinement, becomes a kind of ongoing offense to the balance the mind craves. Outside, the victims remain preserved in fragments. Photographs and videos that were once ordinary become unbearable artifacts. A child's smile becomes an accusation against the world's helplessness. A mother's planning becomes an indictment of the future's fragility. These images keep the victims emotionally present in a way that is both consoling and painful, because presence without possibility is its own form of torment. Shannon's warmth becomes clearer the longer people sit with the record of her life. Not as perfection, not as sainthood, but as unmistakable human presence. A woman trying to build a home, trying to maintain connection, trying to keep a family narrative intact. The children remain the purest contrast of all: small, open, dependent, their lives defined by the assumption that the adults in their world are there to protect them. That assumption is what makes their absence so devastating, because it is the assumption on which all childhood is built. The case's cultural afterlife also reveals how easily public attention can slip into possession. People speak of the family as if they know them because the family was visible, but visibility is not intimacy. The family's public record was never meant to be a crime scene. It was meant to be a memory. It becomes something else only when the future is stolen, when the record is all that remains. As the story is revisited again and again, the most haunting element remains the same: the ease with which domestic normalcy can conceal a private decision. Not because such decisions are common, but because the concealment is built into the structure of family life. Families require trust to function. They require the ability to relax vigilance. They require the belief that the person beside you is not an adversary. A controlling, manipulative person can exploit that belief for a long time because the household is not designed to treat him as a threat. It is designed to accommodate him. That accommodation, in retrospect, becomes part of the tragedy. Not because anyone is blamed for it, but because it illustrates how vulnerable ordinary life is to someone who does not participate in it with ordinary human restraint. A person who is emotionally cold can live comfortably in an environment built for warmth, taking what he wants, withholding what he can, letting others do the emotional work of keeping the household alive. When the household finally collapses into public view, the collapse feels sudden only because the private erosion was invisible. The story's final weight, the one that refuses to lift, is the understanding that the family did not disappear because of an external invasion. They disappeared because the person who held the most power inside the home decided to use that power in the most irreversible way. The home did not fail as a structure. The promise of home failed as a human agreement. And as time continues to move forward in the world beyond the case, new houses built, new families formed, new ordinary mornings beginning under new skies, the Watts story remains as a shadow behind domestic normalcy, not as a moral lesson, not as a warning that can be neatly applied, but as a quiet, devastating reminder that safety is not guaranteed by appearances, and that sometimes the most dangerous thing in a house is not what the family fears from outside, but what has already been standing inside, watching, waiting, and keeping its face composed. Keeping its face composed because composure is often mistaken for innocence in a world that wants the familiar to remain familiar. In the first day's widening attention, the house becomes a kind of mirror. People walk through it with careful steps, not because they expect to find drama, but because they expect to find truth in the small, stubborn details that do not lie. A domestic space tells on itself when something is wrong. It tells on itself through what remains untouched and through what is missing, through the quiet persistence of belongings that should be moving through the day with their owners, through the absence of any sign that a departure was planned, chosen, or even possible. The home holds a particular kind of evidence that does not require forensic spectacle. It holds the logic of a mother's life. A woman who is emotionally present, who is actively engaged in her children's routines, does not dissolve into thin air without leaving behind a structure of intent. She does not vanish from her own future without making choices that reflect that vanishing. Here, the choices are absent, the essentials remain, the patterns are broken, not redirected. The impression is not of someone who left, but of someone who was removed. As the day moves forward, Chris is forced to remain in the center of a growing circle of concern, and this is where the subtler qualities of control become visible. A controlling person often believes that staying calm is the same thing as staying safe. He believes that if he does not give emotion, others will supply interpretation in his favor. He believes that if he presents himself as steady, he can frame the chaos around him as something happening to him rather than something he has created. So he stands in the doorway of his own home and tries to inhabit the role of the worried husband without letting the role invade him. His face remains guarded, his body remains managed, his movements feel purposeful even when purpose is the last thing that should exist in the presence of such uncertainty. The people around him bring urgency into the air. Their anxiety is messy, human, unplanned. His anxiety, if it is present at all, feels deliberate. It arrives in measured quantities, as if he is deciding how much to display. That is one of the first quiet contradictions the case offers. If the missing are truly missing in the ordinary sense, the person closest to them is usually overtaken by disorientation. The mind cannot settle, it spirals, it grasps at possibilities. It collapses into panic and then rises again with hope, and the cycle repeats. Chris does not move through that cycle naturally. He seems to hover above it, attempting to steer the atmosphere rather than be consumed by it. And the atmosphere resists being steered, because modern disappearance is never only physical, it is digital. The missing do not simply leave a house, they leave behind traces of their movement, their communication, their patterns of life. The absence of those traces becomes its own evidence. When a phone falls silent at the wrong time, when a routine stops without explanation, when a person's ordinary responsiveness disappears, the silence begins to speak. Chris's attempts to keep the narrative simple begin to collide with the complexity of reality. Small details become larger. Timing becomes a pressure point. The ordinary question of a morning commute becomes a question with a shadow. The route to work becomes a line drawn across a map. A vehicle's movement becomes a sequence that can be compared to records, footage, and the stubborn memory of machines. And then the case introduces its most quietly brutal witness, a neighbor's surveillance camera. The camera is indifferent. It does not care about marriage, about emotion, about the story anyone wants to tell. It only preserves motion. And motion, when replayed, becomes a kind of truth that cannot be argued with. In the dim early hours, the footage captures Chris's truck and his behavior around it, not a simple departure. Not the casual rhythm of an ordinary workday, but repeated movement between house and vehicle, the kind of movement that suggests loading, arranging, checking. The camera does not reveal what is being moved. It does not need to. It reveals the existence of deliberate activity at a time when his story requires simplicity. A controlling person often depends on the world accepting his framing before anyone checks the edges. Once the edges are checked, the control begins to loosen. The circle tightens again. The case shifts, not with a dramatic announcement, but with a subtle change in the way questions are asked. Less comfort, less assumption, more specificity. When was Shannon last seen? What exactly happened after she returned home? What did Chris do next? What did he notice? What did he not notice? The difference between what he claims and what the house suggests becomes harder to ignore. A manipulative person under pressure often does what he has done in private. He tries to manage perception rather than confront reality. He offers minimal answers. He avoids complexity. He keeps his tone steady to signal reasonableness, and when he is forced to engage, he attempts to do so in a way that reduces scrutiny rather than invites it. This is not an emotional response. It is a strategic response. As evidence begins to accumulate, another layer of Chris's private life moves closer to the surface. The existence of an affair is not merely a betrayal, it is a window into his priorities. It shows where his emotional energy has gone while his family remained in need of him. It reveals that he had already begun, in secret, to step out of the identity he performed at home. The family was not only experiencing his withdrawal, they were competing with another life he was feeding. This is where the coldness takes on a sharper meaning. Emotional distance is not always emptiness. Sometimes it is reallocation. The warmth that should exist inside the home has been moved elsewhere, leaving behind a vacuum that the spouse tries to fill alone. Shannon's vulnerability, her pregnancy, her attempt to repair, her insistence on connection begins to look, in retrospect, like someone trying to hold onto a person who has already left in the only way that mattered. Chris's self-centeredness becomes visible in the way he handles this competition. Instead of facing the damage directly, he appears to prefer the comfort of secrecy. Secrecy is not only about hiding behavior, it is about avoiding accountability. A person who chooses secrecy is choosing control over honesty. He is choosing the power to decide what others are allowed to know, and by extension, what others are allowed to feel. When this pattern is placed beside the disappearance, the implications become heavier. A man who has been practicing deception in his private life is already skilled in performing two realities at once. He has already demonstrated that he can stand in a family home and live as if he belongs there while his mind is elsewhere. He has already demonstrated that he can maintain a calm surface while significant truth is withheld. Now that skill is applied to the most catastrophic situation possible. The investigation continues to move with relentless calm. It does not need to match the public's horror. It only needs to keep following the lines of connection that lead away from Shannon and the children and toward Chris. These lines form through the simplest logic: who had access, who had time, who had opportunity, whose routine intersects with places where the missing could be concealed. The geographical lens widens again, away from the suburbs' trimmed lawns and toward the stark openness of Chris's work environment. Industrial sites carry a different kind of silence. They are built for function, not for life. They are places where the human presence feels small and where vastness can make concealment easier. The landscape becomes a character, not because it participates, but because it provides scale, a reminder that the world is large enough to swallow what a person wants hidden. As this focus intensifies, Chris's outward steadiness begins to look less like strength and more like strain. The body can only hold a performance for so long before it starts to show the effort of holding. Small signs appear: rigid posture, a tightness in movement, a sense that his composure is no longer natural but maintained by force. He is still attempting control, but the control is becoming defensive, not dominant. A controlling person can dominate a household with silence because the household is intimate and personal. In the face of procedural scrutiny, silence becomes less powerful. It becomes suspicious. This is where the case reaches a critical psychological hinge. A person who has been manipulating perception must decide whether to continue resisting reality or to offer a version of reality that serves him. Confessions, in such cases, often arrive not as full truth, but as negotiated truth. A partial surrender designed to relieve pressure while still preserving some internal image of the self. Chris's narrative begins to shift under this weight. The shift does not feel like an honest collapse into remorse. It feels like a tactical adjustment, the kind of adjustment someone makes when he realizes that his previous version can no longer stand. When surveillance, data, and the physical logic of the home have narrowed the possibilities to something he can no longer plausibly deny. but tactical adjustments do not change what has happened. They only change how quickly the world is forced to look directly at it. As the search reaches the industrial landscape connected to him, the atmosphere becomes heavier than fear. It becomes expectancy, an expectancy that carries dread because it is built on the knowledge that small children do not belong in such places, and that if they are connected to such places, something has gone terribly wrong. The sky above the site is wide, indifferent. The machinery stands still. The ground is quiet. The quiet is not comforting. It is accusatory. When discovery occurs, the case crosses a line that cannot be uncrossed. The missing are no longer a question. They are a reality. The softness of hope evaporates, leaving behind a colder silence that is harder to breathe through because it contains certainty. From there, the story begins to harden into process. The legal system does what it is designed to do. It translates horror into structure. Dates, filings, proceedings, formal rooms where everyone's posture is controlled because uncontrolled emotion cannot move paper through systems. The atmosphere in those rooms is heavy in a different way, not frantic, not searching. Final. Chris enters that phase as a man who has lost control of the world's perception but has not lost the habit of trying to manage it. Even now, there is a sense of guardedness in him, as if he is still trying to preserve some remnant of his earlier identity. He remains emotionally narrow. He remains measured. He remains, in small ways, resistant to being fully seen. And the contrast remains unbearable because the victims are not present to occupy space with their warmth. Shannon's humanity is now visible only through remnants, objects, images, the remembered shape of her emotional presence. The children's humanity is now visible only through preserved laughter and photographs, the evidence of lives that were entirely dependent on the adults around them to keep the world safe. The process continues. It moves forward, slow and grinding, because systems do not rush even when grief demands urgency. The world outside absorbs the case as a cultural wound, and the world inside the proceedings absorbs it as a file that must be closed, not because closure restores anything, but because the system cannot keep a wound open forever. And as the machinery of accountability keeps turning, the story remains suspended between what is officially finished and what is emotionally unending, with Chris still at its center, contained now, yet still carrying the same cold impulse that shaped the household long before anyone outside realized that the danger had already been living there, quietly, for a long time, wearing the familiar face of a man who looked from the outside like he belonged to safety. Like he belonged to safety, like the familiar outline of him could still reassure if people stared at it long enough. But safety is not a face, it is a pattern. And patterns, once broken, do not return to their original shape simply because someone wishes them back into place. As the case moves into its formal phase, the story begins to live in rooms that are designed to contain human catastrophe without reflecting it. The corridors are clean, the lighting flat, the air cool with institutional control. Everything in these spaces is built to reduce emotion to manageable units, a schedule, an order, a process. The tragedy enters those rooms stripped of domestic context. A family becomes a set of names typed into documents. A future becomes a series of dates that will never arrive. The warmth of a home is replaced by the cold efficiency of procedure. Chris sits within that procedure as if he is still trying to negotiate what the world is allowed to see. The habit of emotional withholding does not vanish when the stakes change. It becomes more pronounced. His posture is contained, his expressions guarded, his body presenting a kind of minimal compliance, as if the smallest possible display of feeling is safer than any genuine exposure. This is not a man overwhelmed by the magnitude of what has happened. It is a man attempting to survive the magnitude by shrinking inside himself, by reducing his presence to something controlled and narrow. In the public eye, this restraint does not read as dignity. It reads as distance. It deepens the suspicion that emotional coldness was not merely a feature of his personality, but a weapon he knew how to use. In the home, that weapon could be applied quietly, withdrawal as punishment, silence as dominance, a steady face as a way to force others to break first. In these rooms, the weapon is less effective, but the instinct remains, and the instinct is its own testimony. Even when containment is no longer his choice, he still behaves as if he can manage the atmosphere around him by refusing to fully inhabit it. The case's weight does not come from spectacle here. It comes from the contrast between what the system requires and what the absence represents. The process demands order. The absence represents irreparable disorder. The process demands a steady pace. The absence contains a kind of time that stopped. The process demands neutrality in language, and the absence refuses neutrality because it is made of human lives that cannot be restored. For Shannon, the formal record becomes a cruel summary of a woman whose life was anything but summary. Her presence in the story remains vivid precisely because she was emotionally present in her own life. Her patterns were obvious. She reached out, she checked in, she planned, she worried, she organized. She did not drift. She did not vanish casually. Her life had momentum and texture, and the abrupt interruption of that momentum is one of the case's most damning quiet details. The children exist in the record in a way that feels almost unbearable because childhood is not built for paperwork. Childhood is built for continuity, for growth that happens so naturally people forget it is miraculous. The record has no space for that. It can only name them, identify them, reduce them to what happened rather than what they were. Yet their warmth remains present through the fragments the world has seen, small bodies leaning into comfort, laughter caught in brief footage, the unguarded trust that defines a child's relationship to home. This trust becomes, in the mind of anyone who follows the case closely, one of the heaviest elements of all. It highlights how power inside a household is not only financial or physical. It is existential. Adults control the boundaries of a child's world. Adults decide what is safe, what is allowed, what is possible. When the adult who holds that power is emotionally cold and self-centered, when he is capable of viewing his own family as obstacles, the child's trust becomes not merely innocence but exposure. The legal outcome that follows when it arrives carries the blunt permanence of a door closing. It does not feel triumphant, it feels necessary. A system has done what it can do, it has contained the person responsible, but containment is not restoration. It is simply the only response available to a world that cannot reverse what has been done. Afterward, the story changes again, not because it ends, but because it loses the forward motion of uncertainty. It becomes fixed. It becomes something people revisit rather than something unfolding. And that revisiting is where the case takes on its long afterlife, the part that lives beyond the documents and the rooms, inside the broader culture, and inside the private fears of people who never met the family but cannot forget them. The home itself becomes an artifact. Not in the sentimental sense, but in the unsettling sense that a place designed for ordinary life has become permanently linked to its opposite. Even those who never step inside it can picture it: the layout, the driveway, the front entry, the staircase, the rooms where children slept believing in tomorrow. The mind returns to these imagined spaces because they are recognizable. They resemble the architecture of countless other families' lives. The very familiarity makes the story difficult to quarantine, and the case teaches quietly that control can wear an ordinary face. A controlling person does not always look controlling in photographs. He can smile. He can stand still while others move around him. He can appear passive while still steering the emotional climate of a household. He can let his partner do the visible work of family life while he remains the quiet center, withholding warmth, granting approval, withdrawing affection with a steadiness that forces the other person to keep trying. This is the kind of manipulation that leaves a partner exhausted and self-questioning. It can make her feel responsible for the atmosphere in the home, responsible for fixing what she did not break. It can make her more desperate for reassurance precisely when reassurance is being withheld. It can make her more vulnerable, not because she lacks strength, but because she is investing emotionally in a bond that is no longer reciprocal. In this story, that vulnerability is not a weakness, it is evidence of humanity. Shannon's emotional presence, her effort, her desire for connection, her insistence on building a family future becomes more tragic because it was real. It was not performative in the way Chris's restraint often appears to be. She was living inside the life she was building. He was already stepping away from it, and stepping away without the honesty that would have allowed pain to exist without annihilation. The affair, viewed from the outside, becomes one more element of this withdrawal. Not the cause, but a symptom of the deeper pattern, the preference for a private world where he could be admired without responsibility, where he could be desired without accountability, where he could imagine himself as a man starting over rather than a man facing consequences. That private world did not require him to negotiate, to compromise, to endure the ordinary discomforts of adulthood. It required only that he pursue his own gratification. And when a self-centered mind begins to view gratification as necessity, everything else can begin to look like interference. This is the psychological terrain the case exposes without needing to announce it in clinical terms. A gradual erosion of empathy, a narrowing of moral imagination, a shift from viewing family as bond to viewing family as burden, a preference for control over honesty, a willingness to manage perception rather than confront reality. These patterns, once seen, become difficult to unsee. They cast their shadow backward into the family's earlier public life, making even ordinary moments feel uneasy in retrospect. Yet the story's most devastating element remains the simplest. The victims were warm, vulnerable, and present, and the person who held the most power inside their world chose to treat that warmth as disposable. Time moves forward anyway. That is another cruelty. Seasons pass. The world produces mornings. Other families wake up in other homes and do not know they are living inside assumptions that cannot be guaranteed. The case remains behind them like a shadow, not because it predicts their fate, but because it reveals what can be hidden beneath domestic normalcy when a controlling, emotionally cold person occupies the center of a household and quietly decides that the people around him are no longer fully real. And even as the story settles into permanence, into files, into sentences, into an address that will always be recognized by those who know, the mind continues to circle back to the most unsettling truth of all, that the final act did not begin in the final hour. It began earlier, in the slow private shift of a man who learned to withdraw without consequence, learned to control through absence, and learned over time to treat the lives beside him as something he could remove rather than something he was obligated to protect, until the difference between wanting escape and choosing erasure no longer stopped him. And once that internal barrier was gone, the rest of the world became something he believed he could manage the way he had always managed discomfort, by keeping his face steady and letting other people carry the emotional weight. In the weeks after the formal outcome, the story begins to lose its immediate heat. The frantic motion of the search, the tightening scrutiny of the first days, the rapid collapse of a manufactured narrative, those elements fade into the background. What takes their place is something colder and more durable: permanence. Permanence in the sense that a family will not return, and permanence in the sense that the person responsible will spend his remaining years inside a system built to contain him. Yet even permanence is not a clean ending. It is only a fixed horizon. The machinery of a legal system can determine where a body will exist and what freedoms it will lose. It cannot determine what a mind does with itself inside confinement. It cannot determine how a person interprets his own story in the quiet of repetitive days. It cannot force empathy into existence where empathy has been repeatedly withheld. And it cannot erase the impression left by a man who could stand in the center of a disappearance and attempt, even briefly, to steer the world's perception with the same cold composure he used at home. When the public revisits the case, the attention often gravitates toward the moments where performance is most visible, because performance is what people recognize as manipulation. The calm face at the wrong time, the controlled posture in the midst of chaos, the tight, minimal gestures that feel measured rather than spontaneous. But the deeper pattern is less dramatic than performance and more unsettling, the pattern of emotional economy, the way Chris seems to ration feeling as if feeling is a resource he cannot afford to spend. In domestic life, that economy becomes a form of power. A spouse who is warm and expressive becomes vulnerable to a partner who is sparse and withholding because warmth seeks response. It seeks reciprocity. When it meets a wall, it begins to intensify, not out of irrationality, but out of the basic human need to restore connection. The more it intensifies, the more the withholding partner can position himself as the stable one, the reasonable one, the one who is not overreacting. That quiet inversion, making the emotionally present person look excessive while the emotionally absent person looks composed, is one of the most effective tools of subtle control. It does not require insults. It does not require shouting. It requires only consistency. It requires a steady refusal to match the other person's emotional reality, a steady insistence on coolness that forces the other to either shrink or escalate. Shannon's recorded life suggests a person who refused to shrink. She continued to reach. She continued to try to name what was happening. She continued to behave like someone who believed, even under strain, that family is something you fight for with presence. That presence becomes, in retrospect, a kind of tragic bravery, not a dramatic courage, but the everyday courage of continuing to love in a place where love is being met with quiet resistance. The children's place within that dynamic is more difficult to articulate because children do not negotiate emotional climates as adults do. They simply live inside them. They absorb tension the way skin absorbs cold. They respond to warmth by leaning into it, and they respond to distance by adapting, often without understanding what adaptation is doing to them. They become more watchful, more eager to please, more likely to seek the parent who feels reliably alive. A household where affection is conditional teaches children a lesson without speaking it, that safety must be earned. A father who is emotionally cold does not need to announce, and the absence of empathy is what remains most chilling as time passes. Many crimes involve rage, panic, a sudden collapse of impulse control. This story, by contrast, carries the impression of cold decision, the impression of someone who had already withdrawn from the humanity of his family before the world ever noticed anything wrong. The impression of a man who could view his wife's pregnancy not as a fragile life developing under his roof, but as an additional tether he wanted severed. The impression of a man who could look at his children and see not persons but complications. The public recoils from this not because it is rare to feel overwhelmed, but because it is rare to respond to overwhelm with such absolute removal. Overwhelm is part of family life. Marriage is strain, money is strain, parenting is strain. The difference is what a person chooses to do with strain. A controlling person often chooses withdrawal and blame. A manipulative person often chooses secrecy and performance. A self-centered person often chooses gratification over accountability. In this story, those choices did not remain confined to emotional harm. They escalated into annihilation. That escalation is what turns the case into a permanent shadow behind domestic normalcy. It forces people to consider that cruelty does not always arrive with visible cruelty. It can arrive as a steady refusal to care. It can arrive as a person who keeps his tone even while making those around him feel unstable. It can arrive as a spouse who treats emotional connection as optional while the other spouse treats it as essential. And so, when people return to the surviving images of the family, they often find themselves staring at the simplest moments with a changed vision. A child leaning into a parent. A woman smiling as if tomorrow is an assumption. A man present but somehow separate, his face composed in a way that now reads differently. The images do not prove intent, but they capture atmosphere, and atmosphere is sometimes the truest record of all. The case continues to exist in that atmosphere, the warmth of the victims, the coldness of the person who held power over them, the quiet imbalance that preceded the final act, and the knowledge that the imbalance was not simply marital tension, but a pattern of control that left Shannon carrying the emotional weight of the home while Chris quietly stepped away from the bond itself. In the end, the story does not settle into a comfortable explanation. It settles into a recognition that feels like a bruise, that domestic life can contain invisible fractures, and that when the person who benefits from those fractures is also willing to treat other lives as disposable, the home becomes not a refuge, but a stage where the most irreversible decision can be made without the outside world hearing so much as a sound, until the morning arrives and the silence begins to speak. Until the morning arrives and the silence begins to speak, not in language but in the blunt refusal of ordinary life to resume. A house that has been emptied of its people does not look empty at first glance. It looks paused. Beds remain made or half-made. Counters still hold the small clutter of family living. The air carries the faint warmth of recently inhabited rooms, and that lingering warmth becomes unsettling because it suggests continuity where there is none. The mind expects a home to respond to absence with visible disorder, yet here the disorder is internal, concealed beneath the intact surface. Chris keeps moving through that surface as if movement itself can hold the illusion together. He stays close to the familiar gestures of a normal day, checking, pacing, standing, shifting from one space to another, while the core of the day has already been erased. It is an odd choreography, the outward habits of a husband and father still visible in his body, while the role those habits once served has been hollowed out. His composure remains tight, his face still arranged, as if he believes that if he looks sufficiently ordinary, the world will accept an ordinary explanation. But the home will not cooperate, because homes have a logic that cannot be coached. They collect patterns and they expose breaks in those patterns. The absence of Shannon's usual movement through the house is not only a missing person, it is a missing rhythm. A mother of small children leaves a trail of predictable choices, things gathered, things carried, small necessities that travel with her because her day is organized around keeping two young lives steady. When those necessities remain behind, the story of a spontaneous departure begins to feel less like a possibility and more like a cover placed over a void. The day's pressure grows not with theatrical intensity but with accumulating certainty. Each hour that passes without contact hardens the absence. A person who truly leaves by choice usually leaves a line of intent behind her, even if she wants space. A text, a message, a plan shared with someone she trusts. Here, intent is missing. What remains is interruption. Chris's response to that interruption continues to follow the same pattern that appears to have existed inside the marriage. He offers as little as he can while still appearing cooperative. He does not flood the situation with emotion. He does not surrender himself to disorientation. Instead, he stays contained, as if containment is a form of authority. It is the same emotional posture that can control a household, never fully engaging, never fully giving, forcing others to reach and fill the space he refuses to occupy. In the early stages, this posture can confuse people because calm is often treated as a sign of innocence. Calm feels like an anchor. Calm feels like reliability, but calm becomes suspicious when it does not match the stakes. When the absence involves a pregnant wife and 2 small children, the expected human response is not a steady face. It is fracture, it is rawness, it is an inability to manage one's own body. Chris's managed presentation begins to look less like strength and more like calculation, and calculation has its own cold scent. The scrutiny tightens, and with it the story begins to narrow toward him. Not because anyone needs a villain for the sake of narrative, but because the situation's basic geometry points inward. The last known proximity. The locked nature of domestic life. The simple truth that the most dangerous person to a family is sometimes the person who has constant access to them. As the focus narrows, the world around Chris shifts from concern to evaluation. The questions become less open and more precise. His answers begin to matter not for their emotional tone, but for their compatibility with everything else that can be checked. This is where control becomes difficult. A manipulative person can manage impressions, but impressions are fragile under verification. The more verification enters the story, the more his power slips, because his primary tool has always been the shaping of perception rather than the surrender to truth. Small inconsistencies begin to carry weight, not because they are dramatic, but because they do not belong in an authentic account. Authentic accounts are messy, contradictory in human ways, full of sensory fragments and fear. Manufactured accounts are neat. They avoid specifics unless forced. They lean on generalities and hope the world will accept them out of discomfort, out of reluctance to accuse. But discomfort does not hold when children are missing. The presence of children changes everything. It removes the social impulse to give a husband the benefit of the doubt. It turns delay into urgency, and urgency becomes a force that pushes into places where privacy normally protects a marriage. Domestic boundaries, normally respected even by those who suspect trouble, collapse under the weight of vulnerability because small children represent the most basic form of helplessness. The longer the absence persists, the more the household's earlier imbalance begins to echo forward. Not in a simplistic way, not as if emotional coldness automatically predicts catastrophe, but as a pattern that now feels relevant. A man who has been withholding at home is now withholding under scrutiny. A man who has been controlling through distance is now trying to control the narrative through restraint. A man who has been self-centered inside his marriage is now behaving as if the crisis is something happening around him rather than something that has destroyed the people closest to him. This is where the contrast becomes devastating without needing to be named. Shannon's emotional presence is visible even in her absence. It is visible in the way her life was structured, in the way she stayed connected, in the way she anchored the household's rhythms. The children's presence is visible in the traces of their dependency, objects that belong to small lives, routines that do not stop on their own. Chris's emotional presence, by comparison, feels like a surface. He is there physically, but what people reach for in him, panic, tenderness, genuine disorientation, does not rise to meet the moment. The case continues to build itself as a narrative of consequence rather than explanation. The emphasis shifts toward what can be established, the lines of movement, the narrowing possibilities, the places connected to Chris's routine where the missing family might be found. In this phase, the landscape feels increasingly wrong. The suburb that once appeared safe now feels like a stage that hit a collapse. The wider spaces beyond it, industrial sites, open areas, utilitarian ground, feel like places where the domestic world should never have to go. The dread becomes environmental. It sits in the heat of the day. It hangs in the still air. It settles over the search as if the sky itself knows that whatever is coming will not be survivable as hope. When reality becomes confirmed, the story's emotional tone changes permanently. There is no longer a question to chase. There is only a fact to carry. People often imagine that certainty will bring relief, but certainty in cases like this brings only heaviness because it removes the last possibility of an ordinary ending. It replaces the anxiety of not knowing with the cruelty of knowing. From there, the world begins to process what cannot be processed cleanly. It tries to fit the event into familiar categories: marriage breakdown, financial strain, affair, pressure, but the act refuses to be made ordinary by context. Context can frame the atmosphere, it cannot reduce the scale. The story remains what it is, a household where one person held the most power and used it in the most final way. In the legal system's hands, the case becomes a sequence of steps that move toward permanence. The rooms are controlled, the language restrained, the pace deliberate. There is no room for the chaos of grief in paperwork, and yet grief saturates everything anyway, because paperwork cannot erase the central imbalance, that the victims are gone and cannot return. Chris sits inside this process with the same guarded posture that marked his presence at home. He remains contained, as if he is still trying to preserve a version of himself that does not match what the case has revealed. He does not appear to surrender to exposure. He appears to endure it, which is not the same thing. Endurance can be a form of control when it is used to avoid vulnerability, when it is used to keep the world from seeing any internal collapse. But the world no longer needs his collapse. The world already has the outcome. The story's long afterlife begins here, in the gap between official closure and emotional permanence. The case becomes a fixed point people return to, not because it offers comfort, but because it offers a grim clarity about something most people would rather not consider: that a family can be emotionally imbalanced long before the outside world notices, and that a controlling, emotionally cold person can occupy the center of a household for years, while those around him keep trying to create warmth, until the day he decides that warmth is no longer something he wants to live beside. And in that recognition, the narrative does not resolve. It deepens. It becomes less about the event and more about the slow, quiet conditions that made the event possible. The withdrawal that trained a household to bend, the manipulation that made a partner doubt her footing, the self-centeredness that treated responsibility as a burden rather than a bond, until the final outcome was no longer a sudden rupture, but the last step in a private process that had been unfolding in silence for a long time. A long time, and once the world begins to sense that kind of silence, it does not forget it. The case, after the initial confirmation, becomes less a question of movement and more a question of structure. The structure of a marriage that was already uneven. The structure of a household where emotional labor flowed in one direction. The structure of a man who seemed to prefer withholding to negotiating, who treated warmth as something he could ration, who appeared most comfortable when the people around him were trying to win back a version of him that was already slipping away. In the public imagination, there is a temptation to imagine that the final act erupted from a single night of uncontrolled emotion. But what stands out when the timeline is reconstructed with restraint is the absence of eruption. The impression is not of a person overwhelmed by feeling, but of a person insulated from feeling. The difference matters because insulation is something that can be cultivated. It is easier to do irreversible things when the mind has already trained itself to see other lives as logistical complications rather than human realities. That training does not require cruelty in every moment. It requires only repetition of a certain internal stance: my comfort first, my future first, my escape first. It requires the steady practice of treating a partner's fear as inconvenient, treating a spouse's need for connection as excessive, treating the emotional atmosphere of the household as something he is entitled to control by withdrawing from it. The evidence of this stance is visible not in dramatic statements, but in the texture of routine. In how quickly he could go quiet when challenged. In how easily he could refuse reassurance while Shannon continued to reach for it. In how he could allow her to carry the stress of the household's stability while he stood back, unimpressed, emotionally unreachable. Over time, such behavior does not simply strain a relationship, it reshapes it. It teaches the partner that her needs will be met only if she becomes smaller, quieter, less demanding, more accommodating. And when she refuses to become smaller, when she continues to insist on being fully human, conflict is not resolved, it is stored. Stored conflict is dangerous in a household where one person does not process it through honesty. It becomes a private reservoir held behind a calm face, hidden behind routine, fueled by resentment that is never forced into daylight where it might soften. In such a reservoir, blame can ferment. The controlling mind can begin to narrate itself as oppressed even while it retains power, because victimhood is a convenient justification for selfishness. This is the emotional climate that lingers around the case long after its official end. The tragedy did not occur in a vacuum. It occurred in a domestic ecosystem where imbalance was already present, where control was exerted through coldness, where manipulation was quiet enough to be mistaken for temperament. When the legal process completes, the story becomes fixed in one sense and endless in another. The sentence is final. The responsibility is formally assigned. The system closes its file. Yet the narrative continues to move through the culture because the act has broken something larger than one household. It has broken a collective comfort about what family life guarantees. People do not want to live in a world where the familiar face at the dinner table can conceal annihilation. They do not want to live in a world where a home can become dangerous without any visible warning. And yet the case exists as proof that visible warning is not always how danger announces itself. Sometimes danger announces itself through absence of empathy, absence of warmth, absence of honest engagement, absence of the small daily acts that demonstrate that a person sees his family as real. This is where the victims remain central, not as symbols but as the only true measure of what was destroyed. Shannon's presence, even in fragments, suggests someone who lived outwardly. She did not float through her life quietly. She built, she planned, she reached. She carried the emotional visibility of a person who assumes that love is something you actively maintain, something you express, something you keep alive through attention. That visibility becomes especially poignant when set against Chris's narrowing. The more she tried to keep the household connected, the more he appeared to retreat into himself, guarding his interior as if it belonged only to him. The children, still young enough to be defined by trust, sharpen the contrast in a way nothing else can. Childhood is not built to survive emotional games. Children do not have the equipment to interpret why one parent's attention feels inconsistent or why a room changes temperature without an obvious cause. They only know comfort and its withdrawal. They only know warmth and its absence. In a home where emotional power is held by someone who withholds, children become more vulnerable not because they are targeted by overt aggression, but because they are forced to adapt to an atmosphere they cannot name. After the case, these elements become part of the story's lingering dread. People find themselves thinking less about the legal facts and more about the domestic quiet that preceded them. They think about the nights when Shannon likely tried to speak, tried to repair, tried to find a way back to partnership, while the man beside her offered controlled silence instead of engagement. They think about the subtle ways a controlling person can make a partner feel that her fear is unreasonable while he remains the calm center of the room, as if calm itself is a verdict. In the end, calm was not safety. Calm was cover. When Chris is removed from the world and placed into confinement, the case enters another unsettling phase. The family's time ends, but his continues, and the continuation creates a psychological imbalance that never resolves. The prison setting strips away his ability to control the household, yet it does not necessarily strip away the impulse to control perception. Control can survive in small forms, what he admits, what he minimizes, how he frames his own interior life in the limited ways he can still communicate it. A manipulative person does not always lose manipulation when his circumstances change. He adjusts it. He learns what is available and uses it. Even within restriction, he can attempt to influence how he is seen. He can offer selective contrition or selective detachment, depending on what seems most useful at any given moment. He can keep parts of himself inaccessible, as if the world does not deserve full access to his inner reality, even after what he has done. This guardedness becomes another form of offense in the public mind, not because the public is entitled to his feelings, but because the victims were denied everything. The imbalance remains grotesque, their future removed, his future continuing, however narrow. The mind wants remorse to appear in a recognizable shape because remorse feels like a human response that acknowledges the victim's humanity. Yet even genuine remorse, if it exists, does not repair. It does not restore. It does not return the stolen future. It merely changes the emotional temperature around the perpetrator, and the case is too heavy to be warmed by temperature alone. Outside prison walls, the victims' lives are preserved in a way that modern technology makes both comforting and brutal. Their images remain accessible, their ordinary moments replayable, their laughter suspended in time. These records insist on their humanity, but they also trap them in a perpetual proximity to what the world now knows will happen. It creates a form of mourning that cannot move forward cleanly because the past keeps offering itself for rewatching, as if repetition could soften finality. The home itself, as time passes, becomes a kind of emblem of this trapped quality. It stands as a reminder that the physical world can remain intact even when the human world inside it has been shattered. People look at images of the house and feel the same conflict. Nothing appears broken, and yet everything is broken. The suburb, with its order and quiet, becomes part of the story's dread because it reinforces the case's most unsettling lesson: catastrophe can be prepared within normalcy. That preparation is what people keep circling. They ask how the private process unfolded, how the internal permissions were granted, how emotional coldness turned into something so final. And when they search the story for answers, they keep returning to the same domestic imbalance: Shannon working to maintain connection, Chris withholding it, Shannon trying to secure the family's future, Chris quietly investing in an alternate one, Shannon moving through pregnancy with vulnerability and hope, Chris behaving as if vulnerability and hope were burdens he could no longer tolerate. This contrast does not need to be shouted to be devastating. It is devastating precisely because it is ordinary. Many marriages contain strain, many couples experience withdrawal, many people have affairs. But most people, even in their worst moments, do not cross into erasure. The presence of ordinary strain alongside extraordinary outcome creates a cognitive whiplash that keeps the story alive. It suggests that the pathway to catastrophe does not always wear dramatic warning signs. It can look like a slow cooling of empathy, a steady preference for self over family, a quiet refusal to face adult consequences honestly. In the cultural afterlife, the case becomes a cautionary reference, but not in the neat way people prefer. It cannot be reduced to a single rule or a single symptom. It persists as a disturbed recognition that trust is essential to family life, and that trust can be exploited most effectively by the person who receives it most freely. What lingers most heavily is the sense that the victims were not living in a house that looked unsafe. They were living in a house where the person with the greatest power over them had begun to regard them as removable. The danger was not outside the door. It was inside the bond. It was inside the private world of a man who learned over time to use silence as leverage, detachment as control, and self-interest as the only future worth protecting. And as the years continue to move forward, quietly, indifferently, the story remains suspended in the same haunted contradiction, a family defined by warmth and dependence, and a man defined by cold restraint, standing at the center of their world as if he belonged there. Until the moment he decided that their presence was no longer part of his preferred life, and treated that decision not as a moral boundary but as a problem to solve, leaving behind a domestic silence that still feels less like emptiness and more like a warning that never stops echoing. Years pass in the same direction they always do, indifferent to meaning. The neighborhood keeps its order. Lawns are trimmed. Mail arrives. Curtains open in the morning and close again at night. The streets remain clean enough to convince the eye that nothing catastrophic has ever occurred there, that the world has returned to its normal agreements. But a place does not fully return once it has been forced to carry a story like this. The house becomes an address people hesitate to say out loud. Not because the building itself is alive, not because walls remember in the way human beings remember, but because human beings cannot separate architecture from what happened inside it once the association is burned deep enough. A home is supposed to be a container for routine, for small comforts, for ordinary inconveniences that signal continuity. When a home becomes the setting of deliberate erasure, it turns into something else in the imagination, a quiet reminder that the domestic world is only as safe as the person who holds its power. From the outside, it remains a familiar American shape: 2 stories. Garage, driveway, front door framed by the small expectations of family life. That familiarity is what makes it so hard to look at for anyone who knows the case. Familiarity implies predictability. It implies that life inside the structure follows the usual script: parents moving through chores, children leaving toys in the wrong places, a household negotiating the small frictions that build a marriage. Yet the case revealed that the script can be followed on the surface while it is being quietly rewritten beneath. The most enduring shock is not that the family disappeared. It is how thoroughly the disappearance was made to appear, for a brief moment, like something ordinary might explain. That attempt to normalize the unthinkable was not incidental. It was a strategy. It was the same emotional posture that had existed inside the marriage, withholding, managing, rationing what others are allowed to know. The same steadiness of face used to control a spouse's emotional weather was turned outward toward the world. A controlling person rarely begins with overt domination. He begins with tone, with an emotional temperature that makes others adjust themselves, with a quiet insistence that his comfort is the central concern, even if it is never stated directly. Over time, that insistence becomes a household's gravity. The emotionally present partner is pulled into the labor of maintaining connection, smoothing conflict, filling silence. The controlling partner watches this labor without joining it, and the very act of withholding becomes a form of leverage. It teaches a partner slowly that love must be earned, that reassurance is not guaranteed, that warmth is a prize rather than a baseline. In the case of Shannon Watts, the traces left behind suggest someone who kept reaching anyway. The record of her life shows the motions of a person who believes in continuity, who tries to build a family future with attention and planning, who is emotionally visible in a way that is both human and vulnerable. Pregnancy adds weight to that visibility. It turns the future into something tangible, something that requires a shared commitment. It is not merely a private condition, it is a declaration that tomorrow is expected. That expectation becomes unbearable when set against the behavior of the man beside her. Not because distance alone predicts catastrophe, but because distance here was not neutral. It was active in its effect. It created a vacuum that forced Shannon to work harder, to worry louder, to carry the emotional structure of the household almost alone. It made her more exposed at the very time she needed steadiness from her partner, and it allowed Chris to remain the quiet center while she became the visible strain. This imbalance is one of the story's most chilling quiet elements, because it illustrates how manipulation can look like composure. A partner who is anxious can be made to appear unstable simply by standing beside her and refusing to match her emotional reality. A partner who keeps asking for reassurance can be made to look unreasonable simply because the other person insists through behavior that reassurance is unnecessary. The controlling person does not need to accuse. He only needs to withhold until the other person begins to doubt herself. After the crime, the same pattern repeats on a larger stage. Chris attempts to remain calm at the wrong time. He attempts to present steadiness as if steadiness is proof. He attempts to let others do the visible labor of fear while he maintains a narrow emotional display. In the beginning, this can create confusion because people are trained to equate composure with innocence. But in the presence of a missing pregnant woman and 2 small children, composure becomes a kind of negative evidence. The expected human disorientation is absent. In its place is a controlled performance that seems more interested in managing perception than in finding the missing. Modern life does not allow performance to exist alone for long. It is surrounded by records, cameras, phones, timelines that can be measured and checked, and when those records begin to contradict the story being offered, the performance loses its power. A manipulative mind can thrive in ambiguity, but it struggles under verification. The world's attention becomes specific, and specificity becomes constraint. Minutes and routes and movements begin to matter. Domestic logic begins to matter. The presence of personal items left behind begins to matter. The absence of any signs of voluntary departure begins to matter. That is how the case turns from a question into a certainty, and certainty is colder than fear. Fear still contains possibility. Certainty contains only permanence. Once permanence arrives, the legal system begins its work, and the work is not designed to match human grief. The system does not cry. It does not rage. It does not break apart and then gather itself again the way families do after trauma. It moves forward with the deliberate pace of institutions, hearings, filings, decisions made under fluorescent light. It translates a family into language that can be processed. That translation is necessary for accountability, but it also creates a secondary discomfort because no arrangement of words can contain what was taken. Courtrooms and procedural spaces are built to be interchangeable. They look similar from case to case because they are not designed to honor uniqueness, they are designed to manage it. Within such rooms, the most unbearable element of the Watts case becomes even more pronounced. The victims are absent, yet their absence dominates the air. The case is about them, but the perpetrator is the one whose body occupies space. The imbalance is physical and immediate. One person remains present in time. The others exist only as names spoken in formal language, as images recalled by those who loved them, as a future that ended before it could unfold. Chris appears inside this process, still carrying the posture of guardedness, still attempting to keep his interior locked away. The habit of withholding does not vanish when a man loses the ability to control outcomes. It becomes, for someone like this, a final territory. If he cannot control what happens, he can still attempt to control what others see of him. He can keep his face arranged. He can keep his emotions narrow. He can reduce his visible humanity to something minimal, as if minimal exposure is safer than honesty. That guardedness does not change the legal fact of what happened, but it deepens the emotional disgust the case leaves behind, because it suggests continuity in the same behavior that shaped the household. A man who used coldness as power at home continues to use coldness as armor in public. A man who avoided difficult accountability through withdrawal continues to avoid emotional accountability by withholding visible collapse. After sentencing, the story shifts into its long afterlife, a phase that is quieter but no less heavy. The public often assumes that the end of legal uncertainty is the end of the narrative. In reality, the narrative simply changes form. It becomes the steady presence of the case in memory, the repeated revisiting of details, the attempt to extract meaning from what refuses to be made meaningful. Prison, for the perpetrator, becomes a place where time is both punishment and refuge. Punishment because the days are repetitive, controlled, stripped of choice. Refuge because repetition can dull the immediacy of moral confrontation. Within routine, a person can survive without having to inhabit the full emotional truth of what he has done, especially if he is already practiced at emotional detachment. The institution imposes boundaries, but it cannot impose empathy. It cannot force a man to feel what he refuses to feel. It can only prevent him from doing it again. Outside those walls, the victims remain fixed in a way that modern life makes especially haunting. Their images are preserved with clarity. Their ordinary moments exist in clips and photographs that were never meant to serve as memorials. The effect is both intimate and cruel. Intimate because it keeps them present. Cruel because it traps them forever in before, forever suspended in the innocence of ordinary life, forever approaching a future they will never reach. Shannon's presence in those artifacts is not abstract. It is specific. A mother moving through family routines with visible investment. A woman who plans, who reaches, who communicates, who tries to keep the household emotionally connected. Her humanity is made sharper by what was done to it, not because she becomes idealized, but because the record shows a real person inhabiting her life, assuming tomorrow, doing what people do when they believe the world is stable enough to support their plans. The children's humanity is even harder to carry because childhood is defined by dependence. A small child's world is made entirely by the adults around her. Safety is not something she can manufacture for herself. It is something she is supposed to receive as a birthright. In this case, that birthright was violated by the person who held the most power within their domestic universe. The case's enduring cultural disturbance comes from that violation. It forces people to consider that the home's safety is not guaranteed by the home's appearance. It is guaranteed only by the internal restraints of the adults who inhabit it. When one adult is capable of treating his family as obstacles to be removed, the house becomes irrelevant. The neighborhood becomes irrelevant. The outward normalcy becomes irrelevant. The danger is not in the setting. It is in the decision-making structure of the person at the center. This is why the story never becomes comfortable to revisit. It refuses the audience the relief of distance. It insists that the worst outcome can be built inside ordinary domestic architecture. It insists that a man can appear mild and still be capable of annihilation. It insists that manipulation does not always arrive as loud cruelty. It can arrive as coldness, as silence, as the slow conditioning of a partner to doubt her own perceptions. The public, confronted with this, often seeks a clean lesson, a checklist, a rule that would have prevented it. But the case offers something less satisfying and more honest, a recognition that many households contain strains and imbalances that do not lead to disaster, and that the leap from emotional coldness to irreversible harm depends on a particular interior emptiness that cannot always be detected until it has already expressed itself. That recognition does not produce peace. It produces a kind of quiet vigilance that people do not want to admit they carry. They begin to look at domestic scenes with an extra layer of awareness, not because they believe catastrophe is everywhere, but because they have been forced to accept that catastrophe can hide behind the most ordinary mask. Over time, the case becomes less about the sensational facts and more about the suffocating stillness around them. The stillness of a man who could withhold warmth without concern. The stillness of a household where one person carried the emotional labor while the other remained distant. The stillness of the morning when routine was used as camouflage. The stillness of a neighborhood waking up into an absence it could not yet comprehend. And then, beyond all analysis, beyond all narrative processing, the case remains anchored by a single unchanging truth: a family is gone. Not a concept, not a symbol, not an idea. A pregnant woman and 2 children who should have continued living through ordinary days, ordinary mornings, ordinary arguments and reconciliations, ordinary growth and change. the future that would have been made of small, forgettable moments was erased, and the erasure cannot be balanced by any sentence, any procedure, any public understanding. The story ends where all such stories end, not with a sense of completion, but with a void that remains stubbornly present. A house that looks like it should still hold a family, a street that continues to function as if nothing has happened. A man contained behind walls, still alive in time, while the people he removed are fixed forever in memory. And a quiet, devastating awareness that the most catastrophic betrayals do not always announce themselves with visible warning. Sometimes they arrive under familiar light, behind a familiar door in a space built for safety, carried out by a person who has practiced emotional absence for so long that when the world finally demands the truth, he can still stand there and keep his face composed, as if composure itself could make what happened feel less final.